Pet Sematary Bloodlines is directed by Lindsay Anderson Beer and stars Jackson White, David Duchovny, Pam Grier, and among others. And this is the prequel to the 2019 version of Pet Sematary, based on the novel by Stephen King. And in this story, it's set in the 1960s, where you have a young Judd who's discovering the cemetery that, as we know from, if you know from the Pet Sematary film adaptations, it basically brings back the dead. It brings the dead back to life after they get buried to it. And along the way, he ends up discovering more about the cemetery and a lot of the history surrounding the area and stuff. And he also comes across some childhood friends that are having to, going through all the different stuff that's involved with the cemetery as well. Now, here's a little backstory. Now, this movie was actually a prequel to the 2019 version, like I said, and going back to the original novel, I haven't read the original novel by Stephen King, but I have seen the original 1989 version adaptation, and to me, that still holds as one of my all-time favorite Stephen King movies. I can't compare it to the book because I haven't read it, and I've heard from a lot of fans that it doesn't really follow the source material all that well. But even for its own movie, it still holds up to me as one of my favorites, as it was able to blend in great atmosphere, a lot of great, really disturbing stuff, especially with Gage, and a lot of the things they do with Judd and stuff like that, and just everything all around. Just it really haunts me to this day, especially the stuff with Zelda and everything. And so that to me is one of those adaptations where it knew what it was trying to do, and it was also, I think, one of the first original screenplays that Stephen King did to basically write for it that was based on his own book. And so that movie to me still holds up, and I actually really did enjoy the sequel too. Pet Sematary 2 that came out in the 90s, Edward Furlong, I still think it holds as one of my definitely one of my favorite underrated films of the 90s. And it took a while for me to really finish that movie and really get to it as many years later. But I still think that while it's not as good as the first one, it's still a lot of fun and was able to still expand on some stuff that I really enjoyed from the first movie. And so when 2019's version came out, I just didn't really find myself really pleased with it. I thought it was very, mediocre at best and really not that good. It had some good things going for it. It was definitely well made. It had some good performances and stuff. But unfortunately, it does come across as very try too hard and kind of basically doing rehash stuff from the original film. And also just changing perspectives where instead of Gage, it's Ellie that becomes pretty much the main focus. And there's also some cool ideas that I wish they could have expanded upon in the 2019 movie that I think that they could have really added on to, and including the stuff with the Wendigo. But unfortunately, that was never really explored. And I was thinking going into this one that they were going to probably explore some more stuff with the cult things that we saw in the 2019 version, and also maybe add some other layers to as a prequel. And already going into it, from the trailers, I just didn't really find myself really too much interested in it, other than just those small areas, because I've always been very low expectations when it comes to prequels. And so depending on how they really turn out, a majority of the time, they're very rarely work on their occasions. There are some that are good, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. For the most part, I don't mind the prequels of Star Wars. I mean, despite me not really caring too much for episodes 1 and 2, but still really enjoying 3, I give the credit for those. And then also you have Hannibal Rising. I thought was one of the rare prequels that I didn't really mind too much either. And also the Cycle 4 prequel, Cycle for the Beginning. But for the most part, when we get prequels like, for every one of those, we also get a, Leatherface prequel. We also get the Thing prequel. A lot of stuff that's really not necessary, because going into it, I know how it's going to turn out, and it doesn't really add anything new to what I already know from the story. And upon seeing this film, I can say this is basically the same equivalent to those, where it was unnecessary. It gave us little to no really exploration of what we already know from the 2019 version and also the original 1989 version. And stuff that they even added into there, it's very little or bare minimum, or they don't focus enough on. And so to get any kind of pros I'll get into, I will say that the cast in this are fine. David Duchovny, Henry Thomas, Pam Grier, Jackson White, they all try to do what they can with the material given to them, and their performances are fine. But for the most part, especially the bigger names, they're very wasted in this film. And this is probably one of the most wasted cast when it comes to Stephen King film I've seen, probably since Dreamcatcher, where you kind of have some like big names and maybe not as recognizable names in here, but still some pretty, you know, big actors that really come in here and they have little to nothing to do with to bring to the material, because the really it's the screenplay that really holds the movie back the most, where it's such a very blank and very empty and hollow type of story that really doesn't really give any in-depth to any of these characters. And the other praise, to get into that though, to get into some other praise, I will say that, okay, the cinematography for the most part looks good. It definitely has that clean look that's really, you know, good to see. And it definitely kind of reminds me a little bit of like, in some parts it reminds me of the 2003 remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and to an extent. But I will say that there's also kind of a con, because when it gets toward the third act, the cinematography gets a little too bad at certain points, to where the lighting just really makes it to where it's hard to see at times, and it's a little too. It was almost like I was watching Alien vs. Predator Requiem again, but I'll get to that later. And then I will also say too that there was a couple of decent gory parts that take place where you get to see some practical effects that happen, especially one part where Judd's girlfriend in this gets bit by a dog that happens and stuff like that. And then you also have another scene later on where somebody gets killed, and they go into detail with the gore on that. But other than that, though, I mean, and they're okay. And I'll also give them credit that when they get into certain things that explore the backstory surrounding the cemetery itself and stuff, on paper, I could see what they were kind of going for, because there's a little bit of there's a flashback that they show of what was going on during the 1600s and stuff. And the way they kind of played out, it was interesting of where it was going, and I was actually invested in what was going on with it. But unfortunately, that whole flashback is very short-lived and not really given a whole lot of opportunity to explore. And I think had they would have made a whole movie around that, I probably would have been a lot more happy with, because I really think if you would have explored more of like where the actual Pet Sematary came from and stuff from the very beginning, and maybe also explore some of the other stuff that I wanted to see them do with the whole Wendigo, I think would have also worked too in that regard. But that's as far pro as I'll get into, because the rest of it, this was definitely a mess. To get into some of my cons, I will have to say that unfortunately the movie suffers from a lot of stuff when it comes to characterization, because as much as we're trying to get more into involving with Judd, you know, with him basically being a younger version of him in this, because the whole point is basically him trying to go to his hometown and stuff with his girlfriend, and he ends up pretty much reconciling with his childhood friends and everything, and discovering the cemetery. It really seems like there's really nothing to his character that really latched me onto, or any of the rest of them. And also, we get into some stuff that's involving with David Duchovny's character, who's the father that, as I get into some spoilers here, you see from the beginning that he pretty much buries his son in this pet cemetery, and then his son comes back, and much like you've seen the other versions of Pet Sematary, they come back as basically zombies, but more like, I guess it's described more like demons possessing them and stuff like that, where they're essentially, you know, going around killing people and things. And we also do get a dog in this that also comes back to life. And that's the other thing too, is that for a movie called Pet Sematary, they kind of really get rid of the whole like pet angle like really fast, because in the first like 10 or so 20 minutes we get this dog they introduced that's David Duchovny's dog, but this dog is barely used in the film, and then later on he's just killed, the dog they have. And then basically as the movie goes along, you start to see other characters that come and go, especially you have Pam Grier coming in, you got Henry Thomas, who plays Judd's father in this. And like I said, these actors, they have really good caliber actors in this, but unfortunately they're so wasted because they're given little to nothing to do. And then on top of that, when we even get to some of the death scenes, they feel really poorly done and very badly edited at times. On a technical standpoint, it really feels like the director didn't really know how to use the camera too well in certain areas, because it seems like there were scenes where the death scenes were happening, you see like, you don't even see the actual death scenes go for most of the time because they're off screen. And then it's also really confusing some of the editing, because there's a part where Judd's girlfriend gets attacked by the dog, and all of a sudden it's going into this weird jumpy kind of like shaky cam level, and then later on she's in the hospital, and then Judd's basically flashing back to the same scene that we just saw. And I was like, what the fuck is up with this editing? And then as it goes on too, you're also starting to see other scenes where characters get killed off screen, and then also there's some really crazy stuff happening where there's some weird, like, I don't know if these are supposed to be like dream sequences or just very cheap looking jump scares where, and this is the problem I had with the 2019 remake, where you had basically the semi-truck coming out, and that was a weird fucking running theme they kept having, where this truck keeps going back and forth, and it beats you over the head with all the references that you get with this being a prequel, where it's like, oh yeah, remember that from the other version? Oh, remember this line? Sometimes dead is better. They repeat that like fucking 3 times, and it gets annoying after a while, and just this whole semi-truck thing just really gets annoying as you're seeing it just in random inserts and stuff. And I'm like, this is really poorly directed as it goes along. And then, on top of that, when it gets also to the third act, it really feels like it was rushed because we get into it to where, you know, you have Judd pretty much having to go with his father and stuff to take down Timmy, who's the main guy, who's the son of David Duchovny's character in this. And it just really seems like they were really rushing a lot with what was happening, and a lot of time I couldn't really see what the fuck was going on because everything was so poorly lit with it being, you know, being in the dark and stuff, and I couldn't really tell what was happening because there's like a whole sequence that's in a cave and stuff like that where we see a character that's pulling a gun, and then all of a sudden you see the aftermath, and it's like, okay, that was a weird edit. And then we get to the climax that involves where Timmy and Judd and when they're fighting and stuff, but I couldn't really tell who was who or who was fighting. Like, it was really hard to see. And then also, tell me this, why the fuck do we have it to where Judd's girlfriend in this is basically confined to the hospital for the most part, but then all of a sudden we get Donna, she basically gets off-screen killed by Timmy, comes back to life as basically as recently deceased, you know, reborn and stuff. And then she all of a sudden can, I guess, teleport or something like that. These are weird rules they never really established from the other adaptations. And on top of that, what's confusing is, why is she kidnapping her? She gets a hold of her from the hospital after she kills all the staff in there. And that's another thing, too. This feels really less like a Pet Sematary movie. It feels more like it was almost like I was getting Pets, like Children of the Corn kind of vibes, with them just going around slashing people and stuff. I really didn't get that vibe I didn't really get that with what these zombie type people, what the dead are really doing in this, you know. And then the worst part about it is the girlfriend actually lives in this, and they have this kind of like happy ending that takes place and stuff, and it just, you know, and it really feels like her character was completely pointless, and she really had no purpose. One of the other things too I noticed is that unlike the other films, where especially with the original film and then also to its credit with the 2019 version, you also had scenes in those where you had time to latch on with the loss of a loved one and stuff like that, with them dying. In this, we don't even get that hardly at all, and it's very glossed over and everything. And also there's something that happened in the end too, especially when you have pretty much Judd going into back home and everything after he saves his girlfriend. And he sees his mom there, and it's almost like it's just a regular everyday afternoon, like that he forgot about his dad dying, because his mother is not even any kind of, you know, mourning or anything like that. She's just all like, "Oh, hi, son." I'm just like, what the fuck? Are you kidding me? Hell, even the mother had no purpose in this, or any of the other characters. This was like one of the most like very empty and very hollow like Stephen King adaptations that really felt nothing out of this. And on top of that, when it gets to the end too, it just once again has that semi-truck that comes out, and it has to remind you, like, and where Judd's narrating, he's like, yeah, once again, sometimes dead is better. And I'm like, okay, I fucking get it. Oh, man, there are so much things that I could go into more, but I mean, if you really watch it, the movie is pretty short too. It's only about like an hour and 26 minutes, and it really felt like, you know, it went by so fast that I really, you know, I'm already starting to really forget about it. And it's just really a shame, because this is one of those kind of prequels that I think maybe if you would have expanded more on some stuff, like I said earlier, and you did it like a full prequel and stuff like that, I think it could have had more potential. But even then, that's really pushing it, because I think, for me personally, I'll stick with just the original 1989 version, and also Pet Sematary 2 from the 90s. And yes, one of these days, maybe I'll probably also check out the actual book that it's based on and everything like that, because I hear it's really good. But I'm just going to stick with what I know best from the original films. And so with that, this is definitely going to be one of the worst films I've seen all year. And while I didn't necessarily have, like, while it is certainly watchable in some of the other films I've seen this year, it's not saying much because it did have a lot of stuff that really kind of pissed me off. And not to mention, not to backtrack here, but one of the also things that's very contradictory in this is that Judd also mentioned the Judge is encountering this stuff like it's his first time. But if I recall, even in the 2019 version, it's been a while since I've seen it, but in that one, he mentions that he's known about this since he was a boy because he buried his dog there. And I was like, okay, if he knows about this since he was a kid, why the fuck is he so surprised when all this shit's happening in this movie? Because wouldn't he know about it from the beginning? Like, because when his father's telling him and stuff, it's like he's surprised. I'm like, okay, are we ignoring what he said in the 2019 version? So that's weird. But yeah, this is definitely going to be one of those films that I really don't recommend at all. It's hanging by a nut here, and with that, I'm going to give the movie an extremely low, very low disaster rate on the Film Freaks meter. For those of you who have also seen Pet Sematary Bloodlines, let me know in the comments below what you thought about it, and also the other adaptations of Pet Sematary as well, and also if you read the book. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next review. I'll see you later.